Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, True Crime and Felines. If you are new here, my name is Brandy and every Friday I bring you a true crime case or mystery with one or more of my fabulous felines. This is Ghost. Darth Kitty has thought she would stop by and say hello so you can see how big she's getting. Mwah. Okay, you can go run play now. For my returning subscribers, welcome back, my feline friends. And for my feline fans, a big shout out to you for being members of this channel. It's October, so if you are just joining me, all this month I've been doing cases that take place on or around Halloween. Starting next week, I will be back in my regular spot, so you can see all the kitties mulling around. But as always, if a kitty walks by, I will be sure to put them on camera. Oh, and we have one right here. Ghosty Ghost, my love, love. He's my love. Mwah. Okay, this week's case is the true story behind the urban legend of contaminated Halloween candy. I grew up in the 80s, and so the stories of kids eating contaminated Halloween candy was rampant. Parents, grandparents, they'd check all your candy before you ate it to make sure there's nothing bad about it. Did you ever wonder where this urban legend came from, if there's any truth behind it? Well, we're going to tackle this today. So, let's get started. Yes, I'm aware I'm missing part of the flower. That little tiny kitten you saw attacked my face earlier and ripped it off. So you can blame her for that. So first, let me say that clear back in the 1800s, there was like accidental poisoning of like food in general, because back then they had no, regulated food process production. It was all unregulated, so things happened, okay? And then in 1964, a housewife was actually very frustrated with some teenagers who were trick-or-treating because she thought they were too old to be trick-or-treating. So instead of handing out candy to them, she'd wrap something up in a napkin and then drop it in their bag. When they got home, they discovered that she had actually given them ant traps, and those ant traps were filled with cyanide. Now, obviously no teenagers were hurt. It wasn't poison disguised as candy, and you're not going to eat the ant trap. So nobody got hurt or died or got, poisoned from these things, and the housewife was charged for her crime. She said it was just a joke because she was frustrated with the teenagers. But these kind of two incidences fueled the rumors kind of before it became an urban legend. However, the case that solidified the urban legend and made it what it is today happened in 1974 in Texas. So Ronald and Daneen O'Brien lived in Deer Park, Texas in 1974. Ronald and Daneen had a son, Timothy, who was 8 years old, and a daughter, Elizabeth, who was 5 years old. Ronald worked as an optician at the Texas State Optical Center, and he was also a deacon at the local Baptist church. So it's Halloween night in 1974, and the kids are really excited to go trick-or-treating. So Ronald had taken both of his children, and then a neighbor had tagged along with his 2 children, and they all hopped in the car and they drove to Pasadena, Texas, which is about 20 minutes away. Now, Daneen had stayed home because they had this like kind of group dinner with their neighbors, and so the guys took the kids trick-or-treating and the women stayed home. So before I get too into this story, can we just take a moment to appreciate the costumes of 1974? I mean, come on. That plastic mask that you could not breathe in, and that rubber band that would break so easily by the end of the night you didn't even have your mask on. Ah, good times, good times. Anyway, So everyone knows the Halloween rules, right? That if a porch light is off, that house is not participating in the Halloween fun. Or they ran out of candy early. So don't judge those houses, guys. They may have ran out of candy. So Ronald, his neighbor, and their kids are going from house to house. And they come across a house and there's no light on. But Ronald tells the kids to go knock on the house anyway. So they do. Now there is no answer, obviously. And the kids become impatient, so they run off the porch and run ahead to the next house with the neighbor. And Ronald seemed to just kind of lag behind a bit. So the children and the neighbor had visited a couple houses, and then Ronald had caught up with the group finally, just like a few minutes later. He wasn't gone long. But in his hands, he had 5 giant pixie sticks. Now, we're not talking about the little pixie sticks. We're talking about the 21-inch giant pixie sticks. Now, this would be considered like awesome candy to score on Halloween, right? I mean, have you ever gone to a house after receiving all those little fun-size candy bars and you get a full-size candy bar? Oh, yeah. This was the score of candy. So, of course, the kids are all excited and they're like, oh my God, where did you get these? And Ron explains that they ran off too early at that house with no light on, and that they had answered the door finally and gave him the remaining candy they had, which was these 5 giant pixie sticks. Now, Ronald doesn't give the pixie sticks to the children right away, and they probably didn't fit in their bucket or their bag anyway, so he just carries them around while the children are trick-or-treating. But then, it starts raining. Like, of all nights, it had to rain on Halloween night, and it cut trick-or-treating short for Ronald, the neighbor, and their kids. And they were only able to hit the 2 streets in Pasadena, so it's not like they were trick-or-treating long, but they decided, we got to go home because it's raining. So they load the children into the car and drive back to Deer Park. Now, before parting ways, Ronald had actually handed out the pixie sticks to the children. He gave one to his son, one to his daughter, and then 1 pixie stick to each child of the neighbor. So he had 1 pixie stick left. And as they were, kind of standing in the street talking in front of their houses, a little 10-year-old boy walked by and recognized Ronald from church and just said hello. Well, Ronald then gave him the pixie stick because he had 1 left. Now, this next part isn't exactly clear because I've seen a couple sources, but they were either in the neighbor's house or they were outside in the yard or in a garden or something, but there was a table somewhere, okay? And there could have been a table set up with candy on it or something. But there was a mention that Timothy was talking to one of his little friends. And at one point, the friend had grabbed the pixie stick from Timothy and was attempting to open it. And it was said that Ronald practically, leaped over a table to get this pixie stick and grab it away from this kid and give it back to his son, Timothy. So they thought that was kind of odd. But it could have been just a dad trying to, hey, your candy got stolen. Let me get it back for you. So everybody parts ways and goes into the house. Dainine is home as well, and she's being told of all the Halloween adventures by her kids, and everybody is getting ready for bed. Now, Timothy is kind of begging. He wants some candy. Can he have a piece of candy before he goes to bed? Can he, So Ronald relented and told Timothy that he could choose 1 piece of candy to have before bed. And Ronald stated that Timothy chose the giant pixie stick. Of course, let's fuel your kid with pure sugar before he goes to bed. So Ronald opened the pixie stick and he said that the powder was a little compacted, so he had to kind of break it up, and then he poured the pixie stick into Timothy's mouth. Now, Timothy would complain that the sugar was kind of bitter and he didn't like the taste of it. So Ronald took him to the kitchen, gave him some Kool-Aid to kind of wash it down. Immediately, Timothy said that his stomach hurt. and he immediately ran to the bathroom and vomited, and then he started convulsing. Ronald stated he picked up Timothy, and Timothy just went limp in his arms. So Ronald and Daneen rushed Timothy to the hospital, but unfortunately, Timothy passed away before they got there. So at the hospital, staff stated that Timothy's breath had the smell of almonds, which a medical examiner told them that that is a telltale sign of cyanide poisoning. Did you know that? I didn't know that. So now you know that. And then an autopsy later confirmed that Timothy did in fact die of potassium cyanide poisoning. So Ronald explained that Timothy had this pixie stick, and then that's when everything went downhill. So authorities immediately were like, we need to confiscate these pixie sticks that you passed out. Luckily, Ronald's daughter had not opened her pixie stick, and they went to the neighbor, and both of those children had not opened their pixie sticks either, so they were confiscated. They contacted the parents of the 10-year-old boy that Ronald knew from church, and the parents frantically searched the house, but they could not find this pixie stick. So in a panic, they went to check on their son, who was asleep in his room, and he was actually asleep holding the pixie stick, but the pixie stick had not been opened. He was unable to actually open the staple and open the pixie stick. Whew. Crisis averted. So the story had come out in the media about these, poison pixie sticks, and numerous parents just started confiscating their children's candy and turning it into police, whether they were pixie sticks or not, because they were scared that their children's candy was poisoned, and who could blame them? So authorities now had at least the 5 pixie sticks that Ronald had handed out to the children. They determined that the pixie sticks had been opened, that somebody had cut them open. They filled the top 2 inches of the tube with potassium cyanide and then rolled it and re-stapled it shut. Now, potassium cyanide is used in like gold mining, organic synthesis, and in jewelry making. It's actually very highly toxic, and it does not take very much to kill an adult. The amount of potassium cyanide found in Timothy was enough to kill 2 grown adults. And the other pixie sticks that they tested, there was enough cyanide in them to kill 2 to 3 adults each. I mean, a little overkill, don't you think? So authorities started working with Ronald so they could, where did you get these pixie sticks so we can bring in the perpetrator? At first, Ronald couldn't quite remember what house he got the pixie sticks from, which was weird because they only had hit those 2 streets before it started raining, so it wasn't like they were all over the neighborhood. And even the neighbor who had went with them stated that if he was taken back to that neighborhood, he could probably find the house because it was the house with no porch light on. And police had already been up and down the 2 streets and determined that no other house had given out pixie sticks, small or large. So this was a unique candy that was being handed out. So police started pushing Ronald a little harder, like, why can't you remember this? So they actually had walked the 2 streets in this neighborhood 3 times with Ronald, and then Ronald miraculously remembered which house it was. So Ronald pointed out the house that happened to be the house that night with no porch light on. Ronald stated that he never did actually see the person, that when he was on the porch and waiting for somebody to answer, that when they finally answered, they never did turn their porch light on, so it was a little dark, and they just cracked the door and stuck their arm out with the pixie sticks. So all he ever saw was a hairy arm. He never even saw who it was. He just knew it was a man. Well, authorities researched and found out that the house belonged to a man named Courtney Melvin, who was a air traffic controller at the local airport. Melvin was actually at work on Halloween night, and he didn't get home till around 11 p.m., which was well after trick-or-treating was over, especially since it started raining. Now, they confirmed Melvin's alibi because there were 200 people at the airport that stated, yeah, he was here. So he was ruled out as a suspect, and there was actually nobody home at the house when Ronald said somebody handed him the pixie sticks. So police were getting a little frustrated with Ronald, and things just seemed to not be adding up with his story. So they decided to check into him, and they checked his history and finances. What they found out is that in the last 10 years, Ronald had actually held 21 different jobs, so he had trouble holding a job long term. And his current job as an optician at the Texas State Optical, he was actually being investigated for theft, and he was on the verge of being fired there. When they looked into Ronald's finances, they determined that he was $100,000 in debt. Now remember, this is 1974, so $100,000 is a lot of money back then. If you compare it to today's money, he would have been over $500,000 in debt. His car was about to be repossessed. He defaulted on a lot of bank loans he took out, and the house that he was living in with his family was being foreclosed on. So yeah, Ronald had a problem. Authorities also discovered that earlier that year, in January of 1974, Ronald had actually taken out life insurance policies on both of his children for $10,000 each. Now that in itself is not suspicious. Many people do that with their children. However, it got worse. So a couple months before Halloween, Ronald had called the insurance company and upped the life insurance amounts on his two kids to $30,000 each. Then a couple days before Halloween, Ronald called the insurance company again and upped the amounts more and doubled it to $60,000 for each child. Now, the insurance company actually objected to this. They were like, why would you do this? But in the end, they ended up doing it. Now, when the police spoke to Daneen about these life insurance policies, she was shocked. She knew nothing about them and became very frustrated and suspicious of her husband. Checking phone records, police also found out that Ronald, the day after Timothy's death, so on November 1st, had called the insurance company inquiring how to collect the money for his son's policy. A day after? You haven't even had the funeral yet, dude. Jeez. Then, if all this wasn't enough to be suspicious, they found out that Ronald had contacted a chemical supply company and asked to purchase some potassium cyanide. Now, the supply company told Ronald that the smallest batch you could get was in a 5-pound package. So Ronald ended up not buying any that day because obviously he didn't need 5 pounds of it, and that would probably be a little suspicious. So police did suspect, though, that Ronald got potassium cyanide somewhere else. And he laced these pixie sticks with it with the ultimate plan to kill his children and collect the life insurance policies. And that he made up 5 of them to pass out to other children to cover his crime, to make it look like some sick individual was hurting children on Halloween. Police did search Ronald's house, and they found a pocket knife and scissors that had traces of sugar, cyanide, and like plastic packaging on it, and they were guessing that he used the knife to like get the cyanide into the pixie stick. So police did question Ronald, and they questioned him repeatedly, but he always stuck to his story that he maintained his innocence. But regardless of what Ronald was saying, police did not believe him, and they ended up arresting him on November 5th, 1974, only 5 days after Timothy's death. He was charged with 1 count of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. Ronald would plead not guilty on all charges. So on May 5th, 1975, Ronald's trial began. The case got national news, and Ronald was dubbed the Candyman. So you can see where these rumors just started getting worse now, because this is national news that there was contaminated Halloween candy. Now, during the trial, a witness who was a chemist at a local college stated that Ronald had contacted him the summer before in 1973 and was asking him all these questions about cyanide and how much it would take to kill a person. The chemical supply company testified that Ronald didn't want 5 pounds of potassium cyanide, and so and asked if there was someplace else that sold a lesser amount. Friends and co-workers of Ronald would testify that months before Timothy's death, Ronald showed a very high, unusual interest in potassium cyanide and would talk about it a lot and how much it would take to kill a person. He had just learned it, so he wanted to tell everybody, which was weird. And Danine's family, her sister and brother-in-law, would testify that at Timothy's funeral, Ronald just kept talking of using Timothy's life insurance policy money to, take a long vacation and just get some items that he needs. And Ronald's own wife, Danine, would get on the stand and testify against her husband, saying that night that Timothy, supposedly chose that pixie stick, he didn't choose that pixie stick. He was choosing another piece of candy to have. And Ronald all but forced Timmy to choose the pixie stick. Yikes. Now, Ronald continued to maintain his innocence through all of this, so authorities never really did figure out where he got his hands on this potassium cyanide. The trial lasted about a month, and then on June 3rd, the jury took an entire 46 minutes to come back with a verdict. They found Ronald guilty on all charges, and then the jury took an additional 71 minutes to determine Ronald's sentence. And that sentence was that Ronald was to be put to death by electrocution. So we all know that when somebody's on death row, they're usually not put to death right away, that there's kind of years that goes by, right? So while Ronald was in prison, he was actually shunned by the other inmates because crimes against children are not really tolerated by most inmates, believe it or not. So he lived a lonely and secluded life while in prison. Now, Ronald's execution date was set for August 8th, 1980, but his attorney was able to get a stay of execution. So a second date was set for his execution on May 25th, 1982, but it got postponed again. A third date was set for October 31st, 1982, which would have been the 8th anniversary of Timothy's death. And the judge who set this date of execution stated that he was going to drive Ronald to the death chamber himself to make sure that this sentence was carried out. However, legal processes, this date was delayed again as his attorney got another stay of execution so Ronald could pursue his final avenue of appeal. So a fourth date was scheduled for March 31st, 1984. Now, by this time, death by electrocution was deemed cruel and unusual punishment, and it was being replaced with lethal injection. So Ronald's lawyer sought another stay of execution, stating that lethal injection was cruel and unusual punishment. The stay of execution was denied. So, on March 31st, 1984, Ronald was brought into the death chamber, as they called it, for his sentence to be finally carried out. Ronald's last statement to everyone was that he was innocent and that the death penalty was just wrong. He added that he did forgive everyone who was responsible for his death and asked that God bless them all. Ronald was the first inmate in Texas to be executed by lethal injection. He left his belongings to a fellow death row inmate, what little belongings he had, and he agreed to donate his eyes for scientific research. A crowd of 300 demonstrators gathered outside the prison, and they all yelled, "Trick or treat!" when Ronald's death was announced right after midnight. And then they pelted candy at the anti-death penalty people that were there. Real mature, guys. Daneen had divorced Ronald immediately after his guilty verdict, and she had nothing to do with him since that time. She had remarried years later, and her new husband had adopted their daughter, Elizabeth. She also canceled the policy on her daughter. So this case might not have been like the complete true beginning of this urban legend, but it solidified it. I mean, this was national news, and there were probably, a lot of people that never knew the final outcome of what happened, that, it was Ronald doing this to his own son to get his life insurance policy, that they just knew that there was a story about contaminated candy, and that's all they knew. And so, this urban legend got exacerbated by talk. And since this has happened, of course, the urban legend has been exaggerated to include, razors in apples and needles in candy bars. The most recent paranoia in the last, several years is that people were afraid that somebody was handing out marijuana edibles to children for candy. Which, when I first heard this, I'm not saying it can't happen. There are some sick people in this world, okay? But although I can see it happening by accident, because there have been children that ingested edibles by accident, because they do look like candy, I don't see people purposely handing out edibles, because that's a really expensive prank. And I also looked up where this one guy did a whole bunch of research back to the 1950s. And I'm sorry, I should have wrote down his name, but I didn't. But there have been no documented cases of children being like seriously harmed or death by eating contaminated Halloween candy. Of course, this case aside, because it wasn't some stranger just handing out candy to harm children. This was planned. But there's been nothing since then either. So that story you heard when you were a kid about, from your best friend about their, cousin's, sister's, friend's, 10-year-old neighbor's daughter who died from eating, found a razor blade in an apple or died from eating a needle in a candy bar. It's not true. Most reports of contaminated candy turn out to be hoaxes, children trying to get attention, or they're manufacturing mishaps, like they were accidents. It has not been somebody out to hurt children. On Halloween, children are most likely to get hit by a car because they're running from house to house than to get hurt by eating contaminated candy. And if a child does get sick by eating candy, it's usually because it's a food allergy or a food sensitivity, or they just ate too much and it's a sick belly. So what are your thoughts on this case? Do you think Ronald was innocent, or do you think he was planning this for a year before it happened? Which is sick. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments down below. If you'd like to become a feline friend, please hit that subscribe button. And if you would like to become a feline fan, please hit that join button. Thank you very much, guys, for sticking with me throughout this Halloween specials. And next week, I will be back in my normal spot. Also, my channel is about to turn 1 year old. I did my first video in November of 2020, so maybe I'll have a special announcement next video. Enjoy your Halloween, guys, and I will see you next time.